They say you should never let love blind you in business. I made that mistake, and it cost my father's empire $4 million. But the exact second the judge slammed his gavel to finalize my divorce, I walked out onto the concrete steps of the Chicago courthouse, dialed a single number, and eradicated my ex-husband's entire family tree from our payroll in exactly 20 minutes. My hands were actually shaking as I clutched the manila envelope holding my decree. Not from heartbreak. From the pure, unadulterated adrenaline of a predator finally taken off its leash. My name is Sloane Sterling. My father built Sterling Freight from a single rusted shipping container in 1987 into a Midwestern logistics titan. When I turned 30, he handed me a 25% stake, sliding the contract across his mahogany desk with one rule: protect it. Then, I married Julian Vance. The Vances peddled an illusion of old money, but behind closed doors, their trust funds were gasping for air. From our very first suffocatingly polite dinner, my mother-in-law, Eleanor, looked at our company not as an achievement, but as a blood bank. She never demanded anything outright. Instead, she'd sip her vintage Pinot Noir, touch my wrist with her icy fingers, and purr, "Family protects family, Sloane. Julian's cousins are just so exceptionally gifted. It would be an absolute tragedy not to utilize them." Over 6 years, the Vance infection spread through Sterling Freight like invisible mold. It was masterful, really. Eleanor didn't aim for the C-suite where they'd be in the spotlight. She targeted the company's arteries. Procurement, payroll, logistics, internal auditing. My father, whose only flaw was a blinding, unconditional loyalty to me, signed off on every single hire I recommended. He assumed my marriage meant our families were allied. It started with microscopic fractures. A missing shipment invoice here. A long-standing vendor contract quietly severed and replaced by a shiny new LLC registered under Eleanor's maiden name there. Then, the audacity grew. I'd walk the executive floor and see Desmond Julian's 20-something cousin who ostensibly managed procurement rolling into the office 3 hours late, carelessly tossing the keys to a brand-new Porsche 911 onto his desk. Massive steel and fuel orders that strictly required 3 layers of executive authorization were suddenly sailing through the system with Desmond's single, illegible scribble. Worse yet was Preston, another Vance nephew embedded in logistics. I noticed a pattern of high-value shipments being deliberately rerouted to a secondary holding facility. A facility that, according to our corporate infrastructure mapping, was nothing more than a vacant lot behind a dilapidated strip mall. The first time I noticed the bleeding, I confronted Julian. We were in our penthouse, the Chicago skyline glowing through the floor-to-ceiling windows. I laid the procurement discrepancies out on the marble island, keeping my tone gentle, assuming I was just dealing with his family's gross incompetence. Julian didn't even glance at the papers. He looked at me. He stepped in close, wrapping his arms around my waist and pulling me tight against his chest. He pressed a soft, lingering kiss to my forehead. It was the physical embodiment of gaslighting. "Sloane, baby," he murmured, his voice dripping with a suffocating, condescending warmth. "You are running yourself into the ground. You're exhausted. You're seeing corporate conspiracies where there's just a simple learning curve." "Julian," Desmond approved a vendor with a 30% markup. "That's not a learning curve," I insisted, my voice tight as I pulled back from his grip. His eyes immediately deadened. The affectionate husband mask slipped just enough to expose the frost underneath. He dropped his hands, taking a deliberate step back to make me feel isolated. "Wow. Really, Sloane?" he scoffed, shaking his head. "After everything my mother has done to help staff your father's company with loyal people? You sound incredibly ungrateful right now. My family is breaking their backs for your legacy, and you're interrogating me over a rounding error?" He walked out of the room, leaving me standing in the cold kitchen, genuinely questioning my own sanity. Was I being paranoid? Was I the toxic, ungrateful wife he painted me out to be? That's the true, visceral horror of living with a narcissist. They don't just lie to your face, they systematically rewire your reality until you are apologizing for their abuse. But spreadsheets don't gaslight. And neither did my gut. Julian thought his little gaslighting performance had put me back in my place. He thought I would shrink, apologize, and go back to signing checks. But that cold night in our kitchen didn't break me. It woke me up. If he was going to treat me like an adversary, I needed to start moving like one. I didn't bring up the business at home again. Instead, I quietly hired a forensic accountant. Her name was Martha, a ruthless ex-IRS auditor who didn't exist on social media and strictly dealt in cash. For 11 months, I lived a double life. Every Tuesday and Friday at 6 a.m., while Julian was still dead asleep in our Egyptian cotton sheets, I was sitting in a dimly lit, greasy spoon diner 40 minutes outside the city limits. The neon open sign buzzed overhead as Martha slid manila folders across the sticky formica table. Methodically, meticulously, she untangled the Vance family's parasitic web. It was worse than I had ever imagined. 27 employees, all connected to Eleanor by blood or marriage, were embedded like ticks across every vital organ of Sterling Freight. Through inflated vendor contracts, phantom consulting fees, and that shell logistics company charging us exorbitant rent for an empty dirt lot, they had siphoned off nearly $4 million over 6 years. Eleanor had built a shadow empire on my father's dime, funding her country club memberships, Julian's luxury watches, and their entire facade of generational wealth. When Martha finally handed me the completed, airtight report, she looked at me with a mix of pity and concern. Most wives would have dissolved into tears. Most CEOs would have immediately called the police. I didn't shed a single tear. I just paid Martha her final envelope of cash, walked out to my car, and felt an absolute, terrifying calm settle over my bones. I didn't confront Julian with the numbers. If I blew the whistle while we were still married, Eleanor would unleash a swarm of lawyers, dragging my father's company through years of muddy, public litigation, claiming marital assets and shared liability. I needed a surgical strike. So, I filed for a quiet, uncontested divorce, citing irreconcilable differences. I let Julian keep the penthouse and the cars. I smiled through the mediation. I played the role of the defeated, exhausted woman throwing in the towel while the explosive forensic report sat sealed in my lawyer's safe. Some people might call that cowardly, but in the corporate world, we call it playing the long game. I was waiting for the ink to dry. Which brings me back to the courthouse steps. The moment I felt the legally binding weight of that divorce decree in my hands, severing me from the Vance family entirely, I dialed my father's private number. In 4 urgent, breathless minutes, I condensed 6 years of systemic betrayal. I told him about the shell company, the phantom invoices, the dirt lot masquerading as a warehouse, and the 27 names bleeding his legacy dry. My father was silent for a long, agonizing moment. The line crackled with the heavy breathing of a man realizing his trust had been weaponized against him. When he finally spoke, his voice was pure titanium. "Send me the report." The execution was brutally efficient. Within 20 minutes, the head of HR had the finalized list. By 2:00 p.m., a small army of private security guards swept through the Sterling Freight headquarters. I wasn't there to watch, but the operations manager painted me a vivid picture later, Desmond sobbing in the lobby as a guard confiscated his platinum corporate card. Preston physically escorted off the loading dock, aggressively clutching a cardboard box of his belongings. 27 parasites, plucked and thrown onto the Chicago pavement before the afternoon coffee break. The fallout didn't take long to reach my doorstep. That same evening, while I was unpacking boxes in the quiet, gated rental home I had moved into during the separation, the front door rattled violently in its frame. Someone was pounding on it with such sheer, unhinged force that the porch lights of 3 neighboring houses flicked on. I opened the door to find Eleanor Vance. The poised, passive-aggressive aristocrat who had spent 8 years sipping vintage wine and delivering veiled insults was gone. In her place stood a frantic, red-faced woman shaking with uncontrollable rage. "You vindictive, ungrateful little bitch!" she screamed before the door was even fully open, a line of spit flying from her lips. "You call your father right now." You reverse every single termination, or I swear to God, Sloane, I will ruin you. I will make you regret the day you were born. I stood in the doorway, the cool evening air washing over my face, and watched her implode. For 8 years, I had walked on eggshells around this woman, terrified of her polite disappointment. Now, seeing her bare her teeth like a cornered animal, I felt nothing but an absolute, serene calm. You need to step off my property, Eleanor, I said, my voice dangerously steady. She let out a sharp, hysterical laugh, stepping closer, trying to physically intimidate me. You have no idea what you've just done. Our family built half of that company. Those people have children. Mortgages. You are starving them out of pure, petty spite. I didn't flinch. I just leaned against the doorframe and looked her dead in the eye. The only thing being starved was my father's business, I replied, the ice in my tone finally making her pause. You bled us for 6 years, deliberately and systematically. And the forensic accounting report sitting on my lawyer's desk proves every single stolen dollar. I watched the exact second the reality hit her. The fury drained from her face, instantly replaced by raw, visceral panic. The predator had finally realized she was in a cage. In under 3 seconds, Eleanor attempted the most jarring psychological pivot I had ever witnessed. The screaming stopped. Her shoulders dropped, and her voice suddenly softened into the faux maternal purr she had used to manipulate me for nearly a decade. Sloane, darling, she whispered, reaching out to touch my arm. I stepped back, letting her hand hang in the empty air. Julian still loves you. This can all be undone. Just reinstate the employees, reconsider the divorce, and we can let bygones be bygones. For the sake of the family. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of it almost made me smile. There is no reconsideration, Eleanor. The divorce is final. The terminations are final. I stated, my voice echoing slightly in the quiet neighborhood. If you, Desmond, Preston, or any of the other 24 parasites want to contest the loss of your positions, you are more than welcome to sue me. Take it to court. But know this, the second you file, that forensic accounting report becomes a matter of public record, and my lawyers will hand-deliver it to the FBI for corporate fraud. I watched her swallow hard, the designer silk of her scarf suddenly looking like a noose. Call your little army and tell them to start packing, I added softly. Because the Sterling blood bank is permanently closed. I gently, deliberately shut the door in her face and locked it. The lawsuit she promised never materialized. Her high-priced attorney took one look at the forensic report during discovery and quietly advised her that pushing the issue would guarantee her a matching orange jumpsuit. Within 2 months, Desmond and Preston fled the state entirely. The Shell LLC that had billed us for a dirt lot was frantically dissolved, burying the paper trail before the IRS could come knocking. My father chose not to press criminal charges. He told me that watching the Vance family lose everything they had built on stolen ground, watching them suffocate without our money, was a far crueler punishment than prison. It took months to rebuild the departments from scratch, but without the Vance infection, Sterling Freight breathed again. Vendor costs plummeted by 18% overnight, shipment delays completely vanished. 6 months later, we posted the strongest quarterly earnings in our 40-year history, staffed entirely by people who had earned their seats through merit, not a bloodline. That spring, my father formally stepped down and named me president. I stood on the catwalk overlooking the massive, humming warehouse floor where my father had started it all. I was wearing the exact same sharp, gray power suit I had worn on the courthouse steps. The air smelled of diesel and hot steel. As I looked down at the empire I had protected, for the first time in my life, I wasn't just holding the keys. I owned the castle. They say patience is a virtue, but in the corporate world, patience is a weapon. If you loved the absolute, cold-blooded execution of this pro-revenge story, hit that like and subscribe button. What would you have done? Would you have sent the mother-in-law to prison, or is bankrupting her the ultimate karma? Let me know in the comments below.